Good afternoon, my name is Stuart Pyle. I am a management consultant and a non-executive director for Pathway Group, and I've been asked to talk about Apprenticeship Levy and perhaps explain a little bit of the way it works, you know, as a guide for employers. Lots going on. We've got the Apprenticeship Reform Act. We had a couple of years ago, there was a big review, the Richards Review, which actually looked at the way apprenticeships were delivered globally across the industry sector, and several things came out of that review. The first was that there was a real problem. We were providing qualifications at level 2 and 3 that weren't necessarily fit for purpose. They didn't really fit to the occupational sectors, and really we were lagging quite a long way behind our European and actually global counterparts. So as a part of the recommendations from the Richards Review, they've gone away and we've looked at reforming the whole employer process. An apprenticeship levy is the mechanism by which they'll look to get employers more involved in the process. Yeah, it's a tax. It's a tax for employers who have a pay bill of more than £3 million. It is also a digital apprenticeship account that you can then actually draw back that money and additional money for the provision of more training and more appropriate training. So alongside the levy, the second part of that process is that they've done a reform of the actual apprenticeships themselves, and they've gone from apprenticeship frameworks to apprenticeship standards. And there's a big transition between now and 2020 where existing apprenticeship frameworks, the apprenticeships that you may have had interaction with up until this point, will be phased out in favour of the new apprenticeship standard approach. It needs to be said that it's a co-investment. The co-investment that's required is not for levy employers. Co-investment occurs for non-levy employers, that's people with payrolls less than £3 million, and it's also if you want more than you actually have in your digital account, in which case then co-investment is something that you need to actually understand and actually kind of be aware of. Okay, so we'll start with some practicalities. As I've said, to pay the apprenticeship levy, if you're an employer with a pay bill over £3 million each year, you must pay your apprenticeship levy from the 6th of April. You'll report and pay your levy to HMRC through your PAYE process, and the levy will not affect the way you fund apprentices who start before the 1st of May 2017. So all your existing apprentices prior to the 1st of May, they will remain on whatever apprenticeship funding model or basis you have with your existing training providers. So this is new. This is for new levy employers. To give you an example of how this actually works, I've done a worked example. So the levy is 0.5% of your employer's pay bill is the fundamental principle. The government give you an allowance of £15,000, which equates to, you know, a pay bill where the pay bill of £3 million comes from as a threshold. To give you an example, a worked example, if your pay bill is £7.5 million, multiply £7.5 million by the 0.5%, your levy contribution is £37,500. Take away the £15,000 of your allowance and you would physically be paying £22,500 into your levy. Now, that's the money that you either pay in tax and it goes and it will just sit there in the Treasury and actually be swallowed up as a tax. If you don't use it, you have 24 months from the payment date to actual using it date. So it's use it or lose it. Now, in order to access that money back, you actually need to register for the levy. And in order to do that, you have to create an account, you register for the levy, where you can actually receive levy funds for you to spend on your apprenticeships. You can manage your apprenticeship processes, pay your training providers, and stop or pause payment processes. If you are not an levy employer, you are not able to actually do this. So this is your process that you have to do. currently, as I am recording this, or as this is being recorded, there are 18,300 levy-paying employees in what we call Tier 3, which are the smaller end of the levy-paying employers. And of them, only 2,700 or so are registered at this time, which means we've got nearly 16,000 employers who will be paying levy, who won't actually be in a position to actually use the levy and claim that back to actually pay for their training. In order to do that, you need to set up an account, and you need two pieces of information. You need your government gateway login, which you should be able to get from your payroll team. Or if not, you need to go to HMRC online, and you should be able to recover your I think it's a 20-digit number. The second thing you'll actually need is your company's house registration number or your charity number, and then you would be allowed to proceed. Once you've registered, there is a forecasting tool where you can view funds, transactions, your committed spend. So if you put a start on the program, there will be payments for that on an ongoing basis, and that shows you your projected spend out of your pot of money that you've put on. So some quite useful tools in there once you've got yourself set up. I won't take that any further at this stage because, you know, once you've got there, then there's a whole new processes, and perhaps if you require, that's something we might revisit at another time. So, what can you buy with your funds? In reality, people must be must be working at least 50% of their time in England. We call this the English percentage. I'll come back to that in a little time. And we can only fund up to the maximum funding band value for the particular apprenticeship. And each apprenticeship has a different funding value. If you go over that cost of the funding band, then you will have to pay for the additional surplus out of your own money. And you can't use the funds in your account to pay for other costs associated with your apprenticeship. So you can't claw it back against wages and subsidiary costs and things like that. There are complete set of funding rules. If you suffer from insomnia, then it's great bedtime reading, and then that's got the full details of what you can and can't pay for with the funds from your apprenticeship service. In terms of funding, then, there are 15 funding bands, and all qualifications, depending on their complexity, will sit inside one of these funding bands. So each one of these apprenticeship standards will fit inside one of these funding bands. And as you can see, they go from £1,500 for a band 1 through to £27,000 for a band 15. So you'll find that accountancy, for example, at level 4 accountancy will be £9,000. It will actually be here, band 9. If you're doing some of the cyber security stuff, you'll find that's band 12. That's £18,000. If you're doing the leadership and management, the supervisory management level 3, you'll find that's band 7, £5,000. So all the apprenticeship standards that have been agreed, and currently there's about 150 different standards that have been approved, will actually sit within a funding band. There is a document on the .gov website which has an up-to-date list. The reason why we don't print it off or email it is it's constantly being added to with new qualifications. But on there it will tell you each apprenticeship by name, the apprenticeship code, and it will give you the maximum funding banding, which is what this figure represents. There are some additional funding that you can actually attract. They will bring you a deprivation uplift. You might get London waiting. You get an allowance if you're working with an organisation that you're working with somebody who's age 16 to 18. One of the key differences in the funding is that the funding now works differently to the way it used to work. These funding bands are for any age. Historically, you used to have a funding rate for the apprenticeship framework. If they were 16 to 18, you received 100% of that money. If they were 19 to 23, then you received 50% of that money. And if they were 24 plus, you received 30% of that money. Now they've leveled the playing field, and irrespective of age, you get the funding band. And then there is an uplift for a 16 to 18-year-old, assuming that you're going to have to put a little bit more effort in to teaching a 16 to 18-year-old who perhaps hasn't got quite the life skills. As I said earlier, there is the English percentage. And I've put this here because it calculates through HMRC. They calculate your English percentage from the information you provide about your pay bill when you are submitting. And in the system that I talked about, this is actually proportion. It's actually visible in your account. So once you've registered for your account, you'll be able to see what percentage. And as I say, over 50% of their time employees must be living in England. Okay, so that is that factor. Spending the DAS, which is a digital account. There are two different types of apprenticeships to choose from. So now we're turning away from, if you like, the levy payments and actually how you claw that back. And we're now turning towards what you are spending it on in practically and how you would do that. So in the very first instance, you choose a training provider. And when you choose a training provider, there's two possibilities. You can actually buy with your money an apprenticeship standard, or you can buy an apprenticeship framework. Apprenticeship frameworks are what has been and are being faded out, and in some sectors they've gone completely, in others the plan is to fade them out. By 2020, these will have disappeared. Apprenticeship standards are the new qualifications that are coming in. There is a current list of about 140, 150 that have been already approved with apprenticeship standards for delivery, and there are got to be another 100 plus in development, various stages of development. The reason why it's taking so long is that they are developed by employer groups, known as trailblazers. So basically, what with this reform, one of the things that Richards was very critical of is that the apprenticeships were not fit for purpose. So as an employer, you looked at delivering apprenticeships to your staff almost like a CSR policy, a corporate social responsibility. You're doing it to give your bit back to the staff, your bit back to the community, raising skill sets. You've not been looking at it as, how do I derive competitive advantage in my business? And how do we use this? And what's the impact of these apprentices that are coming through and with their skill sets? And that's largely around two things. One, there is no ownership of the apprentices historically. And two, that the apprentices themselves were not overly fit for value. Fit for purpose. So there was no derived value from that process. So what they've done now is the industry itself has devised and developed the core competencies for what needs to be covered in this process. So just to kind of illustrate the differences, because this tends to be an area that is awkward, is that in the top half of the diagram, is what a framework looks like, and a framework has a technical knowledge award or certificate, which is, if you like, the understanding that an apprentice must have. Then they have the competency, which are the skills they must be able to display. Underneath that, most apprenticeships will also have functional skills in English, functional skills in maths, functional skills in ICT if required. So for administration, they will have ICT. For warehousing, they won't. And then they will do like the employer rights and responsibilities. And that, if you like, is a short learner journey. Enroll the apprentice, you go through the 5 elements of the apprenticeship. You then get your component certificates, and then you get your ACL, which is the complete apprenticeship certificate. And that concludes that process. Now, while there are optional units and mandatory units within it, it's a very prescripted qualification. And as such, sometimes what happens is providers are delivering units of a qualification that the employer doesn't, or the learner doesn't need in the work context, but they need it in order to achieve the overarching or the final result. So that fundamentally is a key consideration. Moving now to the standards, the difference is each different standard has different content, but all of them have common elements. And this must take place in sequence. So we enroll the apprentice again. There is technical knowledge and understanding. Now there are behaviours in the workplace. So that's around the impact, and then there are the skills. So it's very much more, it's not just about have you got the qualification, it's actually have you got the experience, are you developing the work practices? And that is a key difference between the two. You then also go through endpoint assessment. Endpoint assessment is independent endpoint assessment. So no longer in the framework, the person who delivers the training actually does the test at the end of it. In the standard, we now have independent endpoint assessment. So it's a bit like when you learn to drive a car, you have somebody teach you to drive a car, and then you have somebody else, DVLA in this case, who then does the driving test to say whether you pass or fail. And that is a distinct difference because there is the potential for fail. And then we have the certification. Assuming you pass, it all goes well, you then pass the qualification or the standard, and you then move on. Okay, and an apprentice cannot achieve the apprenticeship without having passed the endpoint assessment, and that's a real key. So target audience then. In our heads, one of the things, criticisms of apprenticeships, apprenticeship is probably the wrong word for what this new apprenticeship standard is about. It's probably a misnomer insofar as when you say apprenticeship, you think of young person. When you think of apprenticeship, you think of somebody you need to recruit into your business. In reality, we are talking about workforce development. And in that, we can either do existing staff, people that you already employ, or people that you want to recruit to fill a key position. Apprenticeships now are all skill levels, and historically apprenticeships were level 2 and 3. Now apprenticeships are level 2 to level 6, and level 4 is degree level. Level 5 and 6 are postgraduate level studying, and in actual fact some degrees are now here. So just taking a quick aside, if you are doing accountancy, for example, now where before you might do the basic bookkeeping apprenticeships, what you can actually do now with the process is that you can actually do your chartered accountancy qualifications through your apprenticeship process, or at least the learning that sits behind that. There is a question of whether you'd actually get the certification fees recovered in that, depending on which provider you talk to, but fundamentally, the fundamental learning to take you to charter status can be achieved in every step. Now, historically, accountancy practices pay for that training for their staff at each stage. What we're saying now is, if you are paying your levy, you can claw that back from your levy. So your training budget today, as it stands, the money you allocate to learning, you can actually claim some of that back from the actual payment of the levy, and the result is you either end up in a cost neutral position, you're now paying levy and clawing it back as opposed to paying for training, or you're paying both and you're extending your training that you offer to your workers and to your teams and your staff. So there's a real opportunity for employers to really set the tone of how they do their HR, their staff development, their programs of recruitment, and almost through the life, classroom to boardroom. And that is really what you need to start thinking about. An apprenticeship is, up to, you could do a level 5 in management. That is post-grad level study. And that's not something that potentially you'd be doing as a 16-year-old. That is something that if you've gone into a senior management role, then that is something you could pick up at that point and run with from there. It is open to all ages. They're now funded at the same level, as I said. There is an uplift for 16 to 18, but fundamentally everybody else gets the same level. And there are uplifts for areas of deprivation, age, and cost of living, and that means weighting. So you get London weighting. Obviously, it's more expensive in London and other cities around the country, and therefore there is an uplift. Probably one of the key advantages for this is that it's designed by employers for employers. So it's very much employer focused. It's learning activity based on gap analysis on the job vacancy. So basically, the very first thing we do isn't come in and say, here's a product, here's a qualification, sign up to it, this is what we're going to do to your person. The very first thing that we do is sit down and say, this is a skills gap we have in our business. These are the skill sets that we need, these are the behaviours that we need, and then what we do is we build the programme about it, either recruiting somebody new or training one of our own, and then we see how we factor that in. We also look at the impact. So if this person learns these skills, what problem does that solve in the business? So very much more closely linked to actual business need and dealing with the real business needs. And that's the intent of this reform, and that's what Richards was getting at with what he was doing. The other thing is the independent assessment of standards is fundamentally a good thing, because you haven't got a training provider who comes in, does a bit with your member of staff, and then disappears. And you don't really know what they've done, what they've learned. It's disconnected from their work. Now they are going to be raised to a standard where they are going to have to pass a test. And a bit like your driving licence, going back to the analogy of DVLA with your car licence, if you didn't get the job done on the day, then you failed, and then you had to resit. Because your assessor, on the current model, where your trainer is also the person who assesses you, they know what you can do and what you can't do before you get into the assessment process. This is more rigorous because the assessor has no concept of or no knowledge about the individual prior to that. And as a result, they either meet the grade or don't. What that will do is drive quality standards in delivery by the training provider. It has to. And that's fundamentally that's a big draw, because what you're going to be getting is quality training. Otherwise, they will fail. And that's perhaps one of the biggest draws to it. In terms of the way the standard actually works, is that we have the training provider element, which is the on-program delivery, and that is each standard is different, as I said. 20% of the delivery will include a QCF qualification. And, excusing the jargon, what that means is, currently, if you want to work in health and social care, it is a legal requirement that you hold a level 2 qualification or a care training certificate as part of your enrolment process, engagement process to work in that sector. It's a legal requirement. So health and social care has, as part of their training delivery, has the level 2 qualification wrapped up in the delivery, which they must also achieve. 80% of qualifications, those that do not have a legal requirement, actually have no formal learning qualification within it. Doesn't mean you can't put one in as an optional element if you want to. So, for example, if you want to do management at level 5, you're doing an apprenticeship in management level 5, you could always add in the ILM level 5 effective management qualification and get the certification that goes with that, to add the certificate and the apprenticeship together. But that's optional. You don't have to do that. If you do add that extra component in, then very often you are adding in additional learning for the individual to go through the process. And normally a way a provider would deal with that is they would have the learning for the standard, and then they would do top-ups to hit whatever particular qualification you might add into the mix. Once the learner is prepared and has met all the standards and has carried out all the on-program elements, they move into what we call the gateway. And this is the ready for endpoint assessment point. And what that then means is the independent endpoint assessment will be booked, the visit will be arranged, and they will then go through the endpoint assessment process, which could include observations, it could include synaptic testing. If they're doing construction, it could be building something over a period of time. It could be witness testimonies from line managers. It could be completion of a project. It could be online examinations, and it could be professional discussions. So each standard has its own mechanism of how they are assessed. That's pre-agreed in each of the standards as it's been put together. Following that, you actually get the results, and once you've had the results, you either get the pass or the fail. And once you've had the pass or fail, if you pass, great. If you fail, then there is reassessment if that is required. It should be said that 20% of funding is actually withheld in the process for endpoint assessment. And 80% of the funding for the learning actually is derived through on-program payments, which means, if you like, monthly payments throughout the life of the training delivery. And then at the end of it, 20% is held back for the endpoint assessment, to pay for the endpoint assessment. The gateway process, just as an add-in, requires a training provider to sign a declaration that the learner has completed the requirements within the standard. And that's important, because what happens is that means that the training provider is declaring this person is ready for endpoint assessment. that means that as an employer, you can't rush the endpoint assessment. You have that kind of process. Choosing a training provider, then, you need to select an approved apprenticeship training provider. There is a register of approved training providers, ROTAP, we abbreviate it, call it for short. Now, you will be able to pick this up from the .gov.uk website, and on there is a list of all the training providers that have been pre-selected or pre-approved by the Education Skills Funding Agency, the people who kind of validate and facilitate the apprenticeship programs, for selection as a training provider. You will also find that there is a register of apprenticeship assessment organisations, and those organisations are endpoint assessment organisations. And your job as an employer is to choose your training provider, assuming you're not doing it for yourself, which is an option. And you would need to choose an endpoint assessment organisation in that process. If you happen to be a public sector body, as an employer that we're talking to, you will also need to follow the public contracts regulations. So you'll probably need to run a mini competition to ensure fairness in the way you actually select. So it might be not just pick somebody off the list, it might actually be that you go through some additional due diligence of your providers and make an approved supply list of providers. Once you've actually put that together, you agree the price. You and your training provider must agree a total price for each apprenticeship, which includes the cost of training and assessment. As I said, 20% held back for assessment anyway. And the standards, this must include the cost of the endpoint assessment. Now, at the moment, and here's the thing, is that if you are a levy-paying employer, if you have funds in your digital account, then you don't have to make an employer contribution. However, once you have spent all the money that sits inside your digital account, you then must pay a 10% contribution for everything over your income. And that's why we have the projection tool to actually project what your money going in will be into your account each month because through your payroll, and what you've committed to by starting X number of apprentices in each period. You can go over, you can draw more than you've paid into your levy, but there is an employer contribution for the over and above. And that's what we call co-investment. You can actually take the additional funds, you can share the remaining cost of training and assessing your apprentices for that month with the government. And that's how it is. So, for example, and that co-investment is based on the amount that you've declared to the levy and how much we can then actually cut and then how much extra you're going to be supported. It works on a monthly basis and therefore it will be quite fluid. It'll go up, it'll go down. One of the interesting questions currently is what happens if you're over some months and under the next month? There's going to be potentially a little bit of a levying because it won't have a perfect match. Connected organisations, you can register multiple connected organisations, although a public sector body cannot normally or usually be connected in levy accounts. If you are registering on behalf of the multiple connected organisations, you need to think about the structure of your organisation and the PAYE schemes that you actually operate currently and how you're going to spend your funds. And basically, you need to register every organisation that will make an agreement with a training provider for apprenticeship training. You do not need to add any of your other organisations to the account. So what we're saying is, if it's an advantage to you to actually operate it through a single system, you can. Or you can potentially operate them as individual organisations within that process. And as it says there, for example, if you have a multiple pay-away schemes, you could create multiple accounts or have one account for all of them. There is no restriction on the number of connected organisations you can add, but a single pay-away scheme cannot be split across multiple accounts. So in other words, you can't actually take one account and split it. So if you've got one payroll scheme, even if one payroll scheme handles 6 or 7 organisations, you then can't split that down. So the integrity of the payroll scheme is actually there. We talked about top-ups. The government will pay the government pays a top-up, automatically adds 10% to the funds in your apprenticeship service account. And basically they apply 10% monthly. So when you pay your money in on a monthly basis, the government will add 10% of what you've contributed on that month into the process as well. Funds that you don't use expire 12 months after they enter your account. Whenever a payment for training is taken from your account, the service always uses the funds that entered your account first. So they always use your oldest funds, but basically it's use it or lose it. Non-levy employers will share the cost of training, and they will also have the co-investment. So from the very first penny, because they don't pay into a levy, they will always pay the 10% employer contribution in that process. So finally, where do you go next if you need more help? Well, you can get in touch. If you have questions, contact our employer helpline on apprenticeships at pathwaygroup.co.uk. We have a telephone number as well. Or if you want, you can contact the Apprenticeship Employer Helpline, and this is the national help desk for .gov themselves. And as you can see, the telephone number is again there. Anyway, thank you for taking the time to listen. If I've still got you with me at this stage, it's been a pleasure, and maybe talk to you soon.